Hey AP Psych students, it's Megan here with Fiveable, and tonight we are going to be reviewing Personality Part 2. And so just a heads up, what we've got coming up, we're kind of getting down to the wire here with AP Psych. Next unit focuses on abnormal psychology, so the next 2 weeks after tonight we'll be doing abnormal. The first week will probably focus on anxiety disorders and probably depressive disorders. And then the second week will focus on kind of everything else that gets lumped into that unit. And then we'll do a week on therapy, 2 weeks on social, and then we're reviewing for the AP test. So we're getting ready to take that test. It's an exciting time of the year. As always, we'll be here on Tuesdays at this time. So in case you missed, 2 weeks ago was the last time I was on. We were in the personality unit. And we were just talking about how this unit as a whole focuses on our personalities, how they develop, how different psychological perspectives approach the study of personality. And then tonight, our focus is going to be on particularly how we assess those traits of personality. This unit is 5 to 7% of the AP exam, so it's kind of a middle of the road unit. So the first thing, our way that we assess personality tonight that we're going to talk about is through projective tests. And this is kind of the generic umbrella term. And there's going to be specific tests that we talk about underneath here. And just a quick aside, you can see on the bottom you have a little Ask a Question tab. If any time tonight while we are talking, a question pops up, you can either put it in the chat, which is on the right-hand side, or click the Ask a Question tab, which is at the bottom of your page, and it sends me a notification. I see we have one in there already, and I will get to that in a few slides. So that is great. Keep those questions coming because this is a review session for you. So anything that I can help you with is what I want to help you with. All right, so anyways, projective tests. Basically, we project, the theory here is that we project what may be going on in our unconscious mind onto an ambiguous stimuli. And so basically these tests are supposed to get at our inner thoughts and our inner feelings based on how we respond to the stimuli. And so some types of projective tests are like the Rorschach Inkblot test and a Thematic Apperception test. And we'll talk about both of those a little bit more in-depthly as we go here. But basically, if we're using a projective test, I'm trying to get you to let me into kind of your inner thoughts and inner feelings with this ambiguous stimuli. And so a good example of projective test is the Thematic Apperception test, which is seen here. And so in this projective test, people are given an image, and these are 2 examples of images here that go along with the Thematic Apperception test, sometimes called TAT or TAT. And basically, I would give you this, and I would have you make up a story. And so the scene is pretty ambiguous. You might say, oh, the one on the right, they're lovers, and he's leaving to go to war, and then you tell this whole story about them as a couple. And so the scene is purposely ambiguous so that you can create and tell your story. And so if I was a psychoanalytic therapist, then I would take your story, look at it, and then kind of interpret what the hidden meaning is behind what you're saying. So if in your story you're hung up on a certain relationship in the story, and there's like some sort of hang up on that relationship, I might help you dig deeper into your unconscious and help you figure out why the relationship in that story is having such a hard time. Are you having a relationship problem? What's going on with the relationship with your family? Those sorts of things. And so I can use the Thematic Apperception test to try and figure out what's kind of really going on below the surface for you. So the problem with this sort of projective test is that it's super subjective, right? If I'm your therapist, I'm interpreting the information. And so I might have my own biases. I might have my own unconscious drives and unconscious motives. And so while we do use these occasionally, actually having them dig into your unconscious mind, probably not a super common source. We would probably use these more nowadays as a more of a get to know you thing as a psychologist, just to get your patient talking and opening up to you. But we probably today, unless we are kind of a more traditional psychoanalytic therapist, wouldn't rely just solely on something like this to treat someone psychologically. Another example of a projective test, and this is probably the most famous one, is the Rorschach Inkblot test. And so you can see that below. Those are the most common panels. And basically what your therapist would do is, again, sit you down, you're in therapy, and they would show you each of these pictures individually and ask you to tell them what you see. And so the first one, I see a moth. That's what I would say. I see a moth. The second one, I see two people holding hands together facing each other. The fourth one, I see like a frog from the bottom up. And that's all you would do, is you would tell them what you see. Rorschach designed this test as a way to help diagnose people with schizophrenia, because people with schizophrenia saw way different things and had way different interpretations of what was going on. Today, it's used more as, like, again, another icebreaker type activity, or to kind of lead your patient into talking about a certain topic. So again, maybe not super helpful to actually be digging into your unconscious, but it still holds relevance today if you're a psychologist, depending on how you want to use that. So both of those, the Thematic Apperception test and the Rorschach Inkblot test, are designed, or were originally designed, to be projective tests to kind of get at our unconscious psyche and what was happening below the surface. The humanistic perspective, so those were more psychoanalytic. Now we're going to talk really briefly about the humanistic perspective. And so we've seen this pyramid before. It's called the hierarchy of needs. It goes with Maslow. And so basically what happens is, in the 1960s, psychologists are sick of how negative Freud is, right? Freud is all about buried trauma and buried conflict and all of these terrible bad things. And on the other hand, we had the behavioral psychologists, and they were all like, oh, we have no free will. We just act upon things in our environment. And so the human side of psychology, humanistic, came about because of these two approaches. And so instead, they wanted to focus on, like, our potential as human beings. And so humanistic psychologists would say that our person develops and grows and thrives because we seek to move up this hierarchy of needs. And so Maslow, over here, the first name on the list, believed in this idea of self-actualization, and that all people are just kind of working through life trying to reach their fullest potential, their self-actualization. And so you can see on this hierarchy that we start at the bottom with our most basic needs, right? We all need to breathe, we all need food, we all need water, we all need sleep. If those basic needs are met, which they are because we're all alive, right? Then we can move to the next level. And at the next level, we need to feel secure with safe, like physical, safe health, things like that. And we move on and move up. And so as we advance up the pyramid, so do we advance with, like, our personality and our development. And not everybody reaches the peak, the self-actualization of the pyramid, but that, according to Maslow, is why we act the way we do and why we have the characteristics that we do, because we're striving for that. Another name that you need to know with the humanistic perspective is Carl Rogers. He will also come up in the treatment unit coming up, so you'll hear his name again. But he believed in this idea of unconditional positive regard. And so he would say to nurture someone's development, because this is like a really, like, touchy-feely perspective, love and nurture and caring. To nurture someone and help their growth, we have to be unconditionally positive to them. We have to value them. Even though we know that we may fail at times, you still have to be super positive, super just kind and caring and generous to people. And so the nurturing aspect is how we experience that growth. So as far as the personality unit, that's really the most I think you need to know about the humanistic perspective. But like I said, we will come back to this in the therapy unit and use some of these ideas and how we actually treat someone with different disorders or abnormalities. So moving on now to the trait perspective. So these are all the psychoanalytic, the humanistic, the trait perspective, these are all different ways that we look at humans' personality over time and how we kind of organize or understand its development. So first and foremost, you need to know the name Gordon Allport, which is the guy pictured here. And he came up with this idea that personality is made up of fundamental traits. And so whereas the humanistic perspective and the psychoanalytic perspective try to explain like where our personality comes from, like through growth and unconscious motives and things like that, Allport didn't really care about where it came from. He cared about like how we describe people. And so he came up with patterns of characteristic behaviors, things like extrovert and introvert, which how we would like label someone based on their personality. And he focused more on the conscious motives, like why we knowingly do certain things in certain situations. And so, again, this perspective is less about like understanding where personality comes from, but it's more about just like categorizing and understanding different personality types. And so one sort of sorting system, we're going to go through for now a few of the different types of inventories for personality and how we use them to sort people into different categories and describe them based on their traits. And so the first is the Myers-Briggs indicator, which is probably the most common of all personality tests. If you've ever seen this before, you're either a J or a P, an S or an N, a T or an F, an E or an I, depending on your categories. And so what the Myers-Briggs does is basically it tries to sort people into these categories based on personality types. So there's like a spectrum, and you're either introvert or extrovert or kind of somewhere in the middle. You're either a thinker or a feeler. You're a sensor or intuitive. You're a judger or a perceiver. And if you look at these characteristics right now and you're just kind of reading the descriptions, you probably kind of have an idea in your own head where you think you fall. Like, oh, I'm more of a feeler. I'm sensitive and cooperative and things like that. And so the cool thing about this is that there is no like right or wrong placement. Again, Freud was pretty negative, right? Focusing on like traumas and abuse and things like that. In this, we're all just affirming each other's personality types. There's pros and cons to being an extrovert, and there's pros and cons to being an introvert. And so every personality type listed here has different strengths and different weaknesses, and so we all can kind of be affirmed in who we are. There's no like bad answer. And typically speaking, when you take the test, most people afterwards tend to agree with their labels. However, like if I'm taking this test and I'm in a really bad mood, I had a really bad day, I might kind of lean one way or take the test in a different way. And so you actually can change your quadrants or your spectrum based on the mood that you're in. The reason why we have things like the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator or why they're used, sometimes they're used in like job placement, like placing you in a certain department or with certain people as your supervisors to kind of figure out like who you would best cooperate with, people who have similar personality styles to yourself. Or schools sometimes use them in the same way. And we're going to talk in a little bit about kind of the pros and cons of why or why not we should actually buy into this after we go through a few more of these. So that's the Myers-Briggs. I don't know that you'll need to know all of those four, like extrovert, introvert, sensor, intuitive. I don't think you necessarily need to memorize that. I think it's more important for you to just understand the spectrums and kind of what they're used for. Another theorist who sorted people based on personality traits is Eysenck. Eysenck is a biological theorist. And so their perspective comes from this idea that yes, they want to describe us based on our traits, because you'll see there's stable and unstable and extrovert and introvert. So they're using traits to describe us. But this theorist, Eysenck, gets more at the why. So why are some people extrovert, some people introvert? And so they want to back up these personality traits with actual biological factors. And so what they found in their research is that introverts tend to have higher cortical arousal, meaning they just have more kind of stuff going on in their brains. There's more firing happening, things like that. And so they avoid stimulation because they already have so much going on in their brain. So for an introvert whose brain is already kind of highly stimulated, putting them in a crowded room at a big party makes that stimulation like amp up even further, and it's probably difficult or hard for them to focus or continue. And so extroverts, what they found on the other hand, had lower cortical arousal, and so they thrive on those situations, being in a group, being at a party and having all this music and loud things going on and talking to a bunch of people, because that helps stimulate their brain to like an appropriate level. And so Eysenck discovered that there are probably biological factors at play in why some people are extroverts and some people are introverts. And so personality can also be impacted not just with cortical activity, so what's happening in our brains, but also our autonomic nervous system. People who have a more sensitive autonomic nervous system, that means your heart rate increases more easily, your breathing, those sorts of things that kicks in, the sympathetic nervous system kicks in. Again, you're going to tend to be more of an introvert because you don't need all of that extra arousal. Your body already arouses itself quite a bit, and so you want to be in more of like a calm state and things like that. And so Eysenck did this research. It's important just to know the biological factors and some of those biological reasons behind his research. And then the spectrum, the picture here with the 4 quadrants, are just how he and his partners ranked people. And so there's basically 2 spectrums. You fall somewhere on the extrovert-introvert scale, and then the stable-unstable scale. And so if you're looking at this right now, you probably could place yourself in one of those 4 quadrants based on your personality. Excuse me. So take a look at it, think where you fall, and kind of look at that. So after Eysenck, we have the big 5, which is canoe. Some textbooks don't use the acronym canoe. They use the acronym ocean. Same thing. It's the same letters. So I use canoe because that's what my textbook uses. But this is another descriptor of personality types. And so the big 5, each letter in canoe stands for one personality trait. The C stands for conscientious, A, agreeableness, fanaticism, O, openness, and E, extroversion. And so these are a spectrum. It's not like you're here or you're here. It's like you could be here or here or here or here or here or here or here. It's a spectrum, so that you can kind of see the white isn't showing up the greatest, but there's arrows on both ends. And so we all fall somewhere on the spectrum for each of these words. And you can see in the left-hand column are descriptors for both ends. And the biggest thing that I see my students having trouble with canoe is they memorize all the words. They know conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, but they don't take the time to actually learn what those words mean. So if you don't understand what neuroticism is, and there's a question describing neuroticism, you're not going to be able to answer it because you don't actually know the meaning of the word. So I would suggest when looking at this, it's important to, yes, memorize what canoe stands for, but then also memorize the meaning behind it. That's the key, is understanding what it means to be open, what neuroticism means. Are you more anxious, insecure, or self-pitying? Or are you more calm, secure, and self-satisfied? Are you conscientious? That means you're organized, careful, disciplined. Or are you more disorganized, careless, impulsive? So make sure you understand those words on that spectrum. And so that's sometimes called the big 5 canoe, because it's the 5 basically main ways or main types of personalities that we can categorize people with. All right, so this is going to get to the first question we asked here. Peter had a great question. How accurate are these tests? And if they aren't accurate, why do we still use them? That is a great question. So the slide here gets at what do scores on tests like this mean? Well, there's a few things that we can kind of deduce from giving personality tests. One is that traits do tend to be quite stable over time. So someone who is highly extroverted in one occasion most likely is highly extroverted throughout their lives. We don't see huge personality shifts over our lifespan unless there's some like big experiences. I mean, people can change, but on average, we see them as being stable. Scores on tests like this can also tell us about traits like neuroticism, extroversion, and openness. Some of those change throughout our lifespan just on average. Like being conscientious, we tend to get more conscientious as we get older, which also kind of makes sense. As we age and mature, we become more aware of others around us and we become more kind and caring towards others. And that just kind of seems to make sense. We become less like wrapped up in ourselves and more concerned about others. We also can look at factors like heritability and how much genetics play a role in the differences that we see in personality. The big thing is, yeah, we don't necessarily buy into this a whole lot. Personality tests are useful in some regards. So like I mentioned earlier, a lot of times these tests are kind of opening the door to talking to a therapist and things like that. And so it gives you like a springboard for discussing. But I would say we want to shy away from using it as like an end-all be-all for judging somebody, because we don't want to pigeonhole someone into like, you're an extrovert, so you act like this and you do these things, when in reality, we're going to see a little bit later on that personalities can sway a little bit from situation to situation. And so we don't want to just focus on your scores on one singular personality test, because that's not going to be 100% accurate. Another problem that sort of exists with personality tests is that research is showing more and more that, how do I want to say this? Like the Barnum effect, I believe that's in your textbook. The Barnum effect talks about how I could read you your horoscope and I would tell you it's your horoscope and you would say, oh yeah, that sounds like me. I have a conflict I'm working on, whatever. And then I could read a different horoscope and say, yeah, that's your horoscope too. But I could be reading two completely different, like horoscopes. But if you talk to people in kind of these vague terms, we tend to like own those traits and those characteristics, and we think things relate to us even when they don't. And so personality tests sort of rely on this idea of the Barnum effect in kind of vague terms about personality traits and characteristics. People tend to, in their heads, it's almost like hindsight bias, where you're like, oh yeah, that sounds like me. That sounds like me. Even if in certain circumstances, you're like, oh yeah, I don't actually act that way or think that way. So I would say we should be cautious when we use personality tests. There's definitely still value in them for some psychological purposes, especially with like therapists using it as an open door. However, I would be cautious about using it as like a very strict measure of any sort of thing, the value of a person. And then the second part of your question, Peter, about why do we still use them? Well, it's kind of problematic because research is kind of catching up, telling us that these maybe aren't as strong of predictors or as accurate as we once thought. But because they've been around for so long, like Myers-Briggs and all of these terms that we've had around for so long, it's slow to really change, right? If I all of a sudden told you tomorrow that the sky wasn't blue anymore and I had evidence to prove it, it would still take time for you to change your perspective and change your opinion. And I think that's the problem, is that people have grown up, went to college learning about these things and thinking that these things are truthful and 100% accurate. And so it's difficult to change that kind of schema, if you will, about people's perspective. So hopefully that answered your question, and that gets at a little bit more about what the trait perspective is. We have one other-ish perspective to cover. And so this is kind of bridging the gap then between our personalities and our situations. And so this idea of the person-situation controversy in personality asks, is it my personality that's a better predictor of how I will act in a situation, or is the given situation that I am in a better predictor of how I will act? And so in looking at this perspective, we know a few different things. As people grow older, your personality does become more stable, which has to do with brain development and things like that. Personality may be stable, but behavior is not. And so I think that's the key thing to remember is on average, your personality is going to stay pretty much the same throughout your life. But that doesn't mean in different situations, behaviors won't be different. And so I like this cartoon here, right? This lady's cleaning and she's so depressed. She's slaving away her life for others. So if you saw her in this first panel here, you think, oh, what a miserable person and all of these negative things. But then when you see her in this other situation with these baby birds, she's happy and joyful. And so her personality didn't change overnight, but the situation that she was in changed, which impacted her behavior. And so again, when we use traits and characteristics to sort of judge a person, we kind of have to be careful because the situation can also influence how we act. And that leads then to the final perspective on personality, which is the social cognitive perspective. And the social cognitive perspective combines parts of the trait perspective with kind of the social external factors. And so if you remember Bandura, Bandura was the guy with the Bobo doll. And so he was an observational or a learning psychologist. And so his view on personality is that it combines from a variety of factors. It's our traits and how we interact in our situations, so that person, situation kind of combination. And then it's also how we learn to behave through observation. And that's kind of that cognition piece. I'm watching you do something and learning and thinking about it, and then I learn to act that way as well. And then the last piece, the what we think about situations affects behavior. And so it's taking our environment, that's our social factors, and then our thinking about what's happening in our environment, that's the cognitive factors, and then the output is our personality or how we act. And so social cognitive theorists, to kind of summarize that, consider behavior, but also then how we think about situations that impacts our behavior. And the big confusing term, I think it's kind of a confusing term, that goes with the social cognitive perspective is this idea of reciprocal determinism. And so reciprocal means like back and forth, right? It's the same back and forth. And so the chart here that's on the right-hand side of your screen takes a look at how these different factors determine our personality and how those reciprocate each other. So we have interpersonal factors, which is our thoughts and feelings about a given activity, our behavior, which is the outward input, the thing that we do, and our environmental factors would be like our friends, our social crowd, things like that. And so our behavior is influenced by both of those other factors. And so you can see the arrows go both ways. So as an example, the rock climbing one is what's listed here. But for me, we're going to use my dog and thunderstorms for an example. And so my thoughts and feelings about thunderstorms are that it makes my dog sad, and so I feel bad. So when it thunderstorms, I feel sad because I know that my dog is upset and nervous. So those are my internal personal factors. My outward behavior is that because I'm sad, I take him to the basement. Because I feel bad in it, like he feels better in the basement. So my outward behavior is going to the basement. And then my environmental factors that influence that are that my in-laws, they also have a dog that's scared of thunderstorms. They do the same thing. They take their dog to the basement when it thunders. And so I've kind of been influenced by that. And so this idea of reciprocal determinism says that those factors kind of keep playing a role into each other and reinforcing what's happening. So I feel bad, so I want to go to the basement and blah, blah, blah. And so it continues onward and so on. So on a typical question that has to do with reciprocal determinism, like on a test, you'll probably be given like a situation, and then it'll explain like an environmental factor, a behavioral factor, and an interpersonal factor. You kind of have to figure out, oh, that's an outward behavior. Oh, that's like a social factor from the environment. And then it'll kind of get you to the idea of reciprocal determinism. And so it is similar here to this idea of the biopsychosocial approach to personality. We haven't done a review of the biopsychosocial approach in a while, so I've thrown this in here. But basically, our personality or our situation is not just one thing. And so to truly understand someone's personality, we really can't just look at one of the perspectives. It's best to look at a multitude of factors. So the biological influences, like Eysenck saw, is that there's different brain activity, and we know that there's heritability involved and genetics involved in personality development. But that's only one prong. That doesn't explain everyone's personality. So we also have to look at the psychological influences, the learned responses, the unconscious, that's the Freud part, and then expectations and interpretations. And then that still doesn't give us a complete or holistic picture. So to truly understand someone's personality, we also have to consider cultural expectations, childhood experiences, social supports, and things like that. And so when we study these different factors, we study them individually, right? We take Freud's perspective, we take the humanistic approach, we take the social cognitive approach. But in reality, just like most of the things that we study in psychology, to really understand it, we have to look at the whole big picture. So yes, we study it kind of in pieces, but for understanding wise, to truly get it, we need to think about the big picture. So just kind of keep that in mind. And then I don't know how your textbooks are set up for personality, but mine throw in a few odds and ends at the end of the unit. And so these don't necessarily fit with any of the perspectives, but they're just a few things that are thrown in there. And so I want to cover them because I'm not sure where else we would cover them. So in the personality unit, my book also talks about the locus of control. And so we either have an internal locus of control or an external locus of control. And what that refers to is how we view the world and how we approach situations. If you have an internal locus of control, it's kind of an inward feeling that I can control my future. If I work hard, my passions and my successes will come. I'm in control of my own life. I determine my own destiny. It's a pretty active approach to the world, right? Because if you feel like your fate and your destiny are internally determined by your perseverance, then you better take an active approach to life, right? Because you want to be successful, then you have to do it. So that's probably a more positive, probably a better viewpoint that we would like to see. But some people have what's called an external locus of control. And you kind of feel like, there's nothing I can do about my future. Why should I bother trying? Fate will determine my life. I'm just going to go with the flow. Whatever will happen will happen. And it's more of a passive approach. Things happen to you. You're not making things happen. And so an external locus of control is basically everything outside of you is determining your fate. And so it's kind of I would say almost a negative viewpoint, because if you really believed that there was nothing that you could do in your life to experience success, that it was all just fate, why would you work hard? Why would you try if you genuinely felt that way? And so I think trying to train ourselves to have more of an internal locus of control is probably a better approach to life and to circumstances in general. Just some other things that were thrown in the book. The spotlight effect was also in this unit, and this is particularly important for teenagers. But basically, we overestimate how others notice and evaluate us. There was an experiment with some silly Barry Manilow t-shirt, and basically everybody thought people were staring at them and judging them, and that all kinds of people would notice them. And basically what the study shows us is we greatly overestimate how much people notice us and how much people care about us, which maybe makes you feel a little better, right? Something embarrassing happens in class, even notice or even think about it again. I still sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and cringe about things that happened when I was in high school. And then I have to remind myself that, like, just because it mattered to me doesn't mean it mattered to everyone else. And then the self-serving bias is kind of another way that we approach life and how we think about life. Basically, I tend to accept more responsibility for good things than bad things. So if something good happened, and someone's congratulating me, I'll be like, yeah, I worked really hard on it. I did such a good job. I'm so proud of myself. But if my boss is trying to blame someone for something that happened, I might be like, oh, no, it wasn't me. It was, it was Susie down the street. She's the person who's at fault. And so we tend to view ourselves in a favorable light. So we tend to think we're better than average, that we score higher, that we're smarter, that we're better looking than the average person. And we kind of have this idea of unrealistic optimism when it comes to ourselves. And then the last thing before we do some review is how culture affects ourselves and kind of how we see ourselves. So all of these things that I've just kind of covered, they're kind of how we develop our own self-concept. And so it's kind of how we view our personality in a way. And so our culture also plays a role in this. So if we live in an individualistic culture, which we all do if we're living in the United States right now, we give priority to our goals over group goals, meaning you come first. We usually put ourselves first. Also, we define our identity then based on personal attributes. I am a soccer player. I have brown hair. I am a student. Those are all individual characteristics or traits about yourself. And if you think about it, we live in a culture, right, where we're told to be unique, be yourself, strive to be your best. It's all about you, 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 you. And so we tend to think in those terms as well. But other cultures focus on this kind of collectivist belief. And in collectivist cultures, the group's well-being, the group's goal is given priority. And so we may define ourselves in terms of a group identity. So especially in some Southeast Asian cultures, family is like of the utmost importance. And so you might define yourself as part of this family. And that's why people in some Southeast Asian cultures take care of their parents and their grandparents and things like that, because the group, the whole group, is more important than yourself as an individual, than your own goals. And that kind of then impacts who we are and how we act, which is why it kind of fits in with this idea of the self. All right, if you have any questions still, throw them in there. We can come back to them, but I am going to jump to a practice FRQ. And so I'm not going to do the whole big spiel anymore about the chug sodas, because I feel like at this point in the year, we've hopefully practiced FRQs enough. And so what I really just need you to remember to do at this point when you're writing an FRQ is to first define the term and then apply it to the scenario. And you should be doing that every single time. And so our scenario tonight is about Ruben. Ruben is worried about his upcoming math finals. He is so worried, in fact, that he is considering coming up with a plan to cheat on the actual exam. Use the following terms to discuss how they would impact Ruben and his decision to cheat or not cheat on his math final. And I would say this is a fairly common FRQ format. They give you a scenario, and then you have to talk about how something would impact a choice to do or not do something. And so that is the key that sometimes people mess up on, is that we forget to include then how we say that this will impact him. Will it make him want to cheat, or will it make him not want to cheat on an exam? And so I have my responses here, and I'll kind of talk through them with you. So the first answer, or the first term, was projection. And so I start right off the bat with a detailed definition. Projection, and I underlined it. You should always underline your terms. It draws attention to it. Projection is one of Freud's defense mechanisms that people unconsciously use to protect ourselves from inner conflict or anxiety. So that's kind of a general definition of a defense mechanism. So then I jump in and say, in particular, projection involves us seeing our faults and insecurities in others, incorrectly so or not. So that is my overall definition. I've shown the person that I understand what the word projection means. Now I have to talk about Ruben and how it's going to impact him deciding to cheat or not on the test. In his head, Ruben may accuse everyone else of cheating on the math exam. Therefore, he may think that it is okay for him to cheat as well. This may lead him to make the decision that cheating on the test is okay because everyone else is doing it. So I set up the scenario. I think if you would have just had this first sentence here, in his head, to the as well part, if you only included that, I don't know that it would have scored. I think you need to kind of bring it full circle and explain that then his decision making is being altered by this defense mechanism because he feels this sort of anxiety unconsciously about his preparation for the test. And so if he's projecting, oh, well, everyone else cheats, then I can cheat too because it's not a big deal because everyone else is doing it. Second term is conscientiousness. We talked about that tonight. Conscientiousness is one of the big 5 personality traits used to describe people. People who are conscientious tend to be careful, achievement-minded, dutiful, and orderly. That's my definition. I've clearly shown that I understand that word. If Reuben ranks high on a scale for being conscientious, he will most likely not give in to his temptation for cheating. Instead, he will want to work hard and be successful on his own. And so I'm talking here about how he's achievement-minded, he wants to be successful. Therefore, someone who's high on the conscientious scale wouldn't want to cheat because they want to experience that achievement on their own. Katrina is asking a question, good question. Is this part of an FRQ or an entire FRQ? So on the AP test, your FRQ is going to have probably, I think, 7 to 8 terms on it. So this is just a smaller version. My responses are complete for each term. So like if projection was a term on the FRQ, that is a complete answer, but you'd have to do more. There'd be more terms listed on the FRQ as a whole. So usually they give you a shorter scenario, and it might be longer. It'll probably be a little longer than this. I was just condensing it down. But they'll give you a scenario like this, and instead of 3 bullet points listed, projection, conscientiousness, extrinsic, there'll be 7, 8 terms listed, and then you'll apply them back to the situation. Another thing to be aware of is sometimes the FRQs will have like a part A and a part B. So be very careful when you're reading the scenario to make sure that you're answering the proper part of the FRQ, because that's sometimes tricky. And we could look at a part A, part B one maybe in our review, just so we're aware of it. Good question. If I did not answer that well enough, let me know and I can kind of circle back to that. And then our last term is extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation involves people who are driven to reach success by factors outside of themselves, such as money, grades, and praise. If Reuben is motivated by extrinsic factors, he may not care about actually learning the math material. Instead, he would rather just get a good grade. This may lead him to decide to cheat on the exam since all he cares about is the external reward, i.e. the grade. So again, I think if you wrote just this sentence here, if Reuben is motivated by extrinsic factors, I don't think that's enough. I think you need to bring it full circle and explain fully why that term is shown in that answer. We have another question, good question here about FRQs. Do you necessarily have to put those terms in the order when you answer them? So you don't have to, but I would highly, highly recommend it because the people who grade these, some of my coworkers are AP graders, and they sit in a little room, not a little room, they sit in a big room all day and they just grade FRQ after FRQ. And so what might happen is if you go out of order, it's just easier for like humans to make a mistake. And so I always teach my students to do everything in your power to make sure that someone doesn't make a mistake on your FRQ. So I would strongly suggest going in order. And so let's say the terms are projection, conscientiousness, and extrinsic motivation. But you don't know what conscientiousness is, but you want to save time and come back to it. I would just write my projection answer, skip a bunch of lines, and then go to extrinsic motivation, and at least write conscientiousness in. So like it's a note to yourself that you're going to come back and answer it, but even if you don't fill it in, there's at least a spot there. The reader sees it and kind of moves on. So I would highly recommend always going in order. Even if you're uncertain of a term, just leave some room and write the term down. And if you have time, come back to it, because you want to make sure you answer the ones you know first. Which leads us into our next question, which is also a really good question. How much time do we get per FRQ? You get 50 minutes total to respond to the 2 FRQs. There's 2 FRQs on the test with like 7 to 8 terms each on them. So again, the thing with FRQs is don't waste your time on a term. If you don't know conscientiousness, skip down to one that you do know, because you want to make sure that you're getting the for sure points, right? You don't want to waste a bunch of time on a term that you're like, gosh, I just can't remember. And honestly, that's going to happen on the FRQ, right? The FRQ is super specific, and so sometimes there's just words on there that you blank on, and that's okay. Because the national average, and again, I tell my students this, the national average on the FRQ is below a 50%. So if you even feel confident in 50% of those words, that's awesome. You're going to do above the national average. That's really, really good. So don't feel bad skipping a term, but again, leave yourself that space to come back if you have time to try and take a guess at it. And so, yeah, 2 FRQs, 50 minutes total, so 25 minutes per FRQ. Make sure you answer both of them. Sometimes kids forget to go to the second one. There's always 2 FRQs. And as Peter said here, there's part A, part B, part C. So sometimes there's multiple parts on the FRQ. So make sure you look for both FRQs and all parts of the FRQs listed in the booklet. Good questions, you guys. All right, I have 5 multiple choice review questions then, and then that's it for my session tonight. So just some kind of review from this unit as a whole. Some of it is stuff that we reviewed tonight. Some of it is stuff from last week. If you look at the poll tab down at the bottom where it says polls, you can click on that and you can put for question 1 your answer, A, B, C, D, or E. It's anonymous, so don't feel ashamed of guessing. And so the first question says, Elizabeth Barrett believes that her students' most important personal characteristics are those that distinguish them as uniquely different from most other people. Her attitude best illustrates one of the consequences of... So again, click on polls, put your answer in there. I'll give you like 30 more seconds to think about it and put your choice. Yeah, so we've got quite a few people putting A, individualism as their answer, which is 100% correct. Good job. I am going to delete that so it's off of the tab now. Yeah, it's individualism because the words, I think, unique here, that's a hint, and different from other people. And we talked about that. People in individualistic cultures are all about like what makes you stand out, what makes you special, what makes you unique. Second question, which theorists have been most directly criticized for underestimating the variability of behavior from situation to situation? So we didn't directly touch on this, but thinking about what each perspective believes, I think can get you there. And this was a question that kind of stumped some of my students this semester. So we just finished testing on personality this week. So go into the polls for question 2, take a guess. I've got a couple answers, give you a little bit more time. Sorry, it's the daylight savings time is killing me here. All right, for question 2, the answer is actually C, the trait perspective. And the reason that it's the trait perspective is because we're so focused on, with traits, right? You're this or you're that, you're this or you're that. And so trait theorists, again, are more rigid. And we talked about that with like why we don't necessarily completely buy into personality tests and things like that, because they don't take into account the different situations that we could be in and how they impact our personality. And so trait theorists are more of like, yep, this is who you are and this is who you are from situation to situation. They don't necessarily take into account those differences. So let me delete question 2 out of here. All right. Question 3. Which of the following personality assessments would most likely be used by social cognitive psychologists? This one's hard too. So think about what a social cognitive psychologist would do. Read over those choices and make your selection. See what people are putting. Be like 10 more seconds and then we'll talk about the answer. This one's a pretty tricky question. All right, so yeah, the answer is D. I'll tell you how I think we should kind of get there. So observing is the key word, observing and evaluating. So if we remember that social cognitive goes with Bandura, he's the person, right? And Bandura is all about observational learning, then observing and evaluating a student-teacher's performance. I also think you could have gotten there through process of elimination. A sounds like something a trait theorist would do, so that's not social cognitive. B sounds maybe something like a humanist or a psychoanalytic perspective. C sounds like a Freud thing, so that's not social cognitive. And E sounds like more about your self-concept and not necessarily social cognitive. So I think you could have gotten there in two different ways, either through the Bandura observational way or through process of elimination. And I think those are skills you really want to practice when test taking, because you might not like look at that and outwardly be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But if you look for those little key words, like observational always has to do with like the learning unit and things like that, you can sometimes get to the answers even if you're not sure just by looking at the question. All right, question 4. Erik Erikson's theory predicted that adolescents are focused on forming a stable identity. This focus may explain why adolescents are prone to A, B, C, D, or E. Question 4. So this is another one where we're kind of combining stuff from multiple units. So we didn't really talk about Erik Erikson in this unit, but we're applying concepts from previous units to this unit's material. And so typically speaking, the better understanding you have from one unit can kind of help you out in another. And so the answer for this question, number 4, is A, the spotlight effect. Good job. So the spotlight effect is all about you worrying about, right, people are judging you and looking at you and noticing you. And basically, because at this time, what we're trying to do is form an identity, right? Identity versus like role confusion. We're so wrapped up in like who we are and what we're becoming, we think that other people are too. And so that's why adolescents tend to be more prone to the spotlight effect, because you're at that stage of conflict where you're trying to figure out yourself who you are. And so you think everyone's judging you and noticing you, even in reality, that's not the case. All right, and then the last question for tonight. Because she is often rejected by her parents, Sally mistrusts other people and treats them with hostility, which leads to their rejection of her. This cycle of rejection, mistrust, hostility, and further rejection illustrates what is meant by A, B, C, D, or E. We got lots of answers on this one. The answer here is reciprocal determinism. So her being rejected by her parents, that's the like social factors, right? Those are those social factors that are impacting her. She mistrusts other people. Those are her internal personal factors which are influencing her. And then she treats people with hostility. Those are her outward behaviors. And so then that continues that cycle, because then other people reject her and then she mistrusts them and so on and so forth. So it's that reciprocal determinism happening because there are those three prongs, the parents rejecting her, her thoughts about the rejection, her actions towards the rejection. So those were just some review questions. I picked some pretty hard ones tonight just to kind of challenge us a little bit and to get you some examples of what you might see on the AP test. Those would be on the hard end, I would think. So just as some reminders, next week, like I said, we're going to be covering abnormal, the first portion of the unit. And if you are interested in any of our previous review sessions, you can always join Fiveable Plus, which gives you access to all AP classes, all review sessions, anything that we've done, and some super cool upcoming review sessions that we'll be doing. Make sure you follow us on YouTube. Join the student Facebook page. You can talk to us and ask us questions there, and make sure you register for upcoming live interviews. I will see you guys all next week. Have a good night.